From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. Let me begin by thanking the Board of Governors of the Middle East Institute and the many well-wishers. I was appointed president. I'm thrilled and honored to take on that responsibility, and I look forward to working with my colleagues and the team and the board to carry the Middle East Institute to its next phase. And I want to thank outgoing President Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain for her 12 years of exceptional service and bringing MEI to where it is today. So we thank everyone for that. And let's get right into today's podcast. We're going to sort of cut it up into two pieces. One will be a sort of part two of a continuing discussion on the case of Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. That's a continuation of a discussion we started last week. And then I want to focus a bit on the upcoming parliamentary elections in Afghanistan. So let me start first with the Khashoggi affair, the Khashoggi tragedy. It's been more than 2 weeks since he disappeared in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, accumulating evidence indicating that he was likely killed either intentionally or as part of an interrogation in that consulate. With me to discuss that as a continuation of last week's podcast is my colleague, Ambassador Jerry Feierstein, who's the Director of Policy Programs and Government Relations here at MEI, and my colleague Gonul, Director of the Turkey Program. Welcome again, both.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
And Jerry, let me start with you. Where are we 1 week after last week's discussion of this? What do we know? Where does the U.S. seem to be going?
Well, I think that what's happened over the last few days, of course, is that the evidence for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi continues to mount. The Turks continue to play out additional information, additional details about the story. And so I think that in terms of understanding what exactly happened at that consulate in Istanbul, the dust is settling, and I think people are becoming more and more confident that we understand. So to a large extent, what's happened over these last few days is that the focus has shifted a little bit from the what happened to Jamal Khashoggi story to what does this mean for U.S.-Saudi relations, and particularly how is the Trump administration managing this issue? And, of course, a lot of attention on Secretary Pompeo's visit to Riyadh and then to Ankara, and the comments that President Trump has made based on his own conversations with senior Saudis, as well as some of the speculation that he's engaged in.
Well, it seems that on the U.S. side, in the Republican Party, if we can still call it one party, that President Trump seems to be going in the direction of wanting to paper it over, casting doubt on all sort of potential realities and wanting to sort of move forward or move over it or, ignore it to some degree. Whereas the Senate, obviously Democrats, but certainly some prominent Republicans are saying, hell no, that this is a real marker in the relationship. How do you see that playing out?
Well, it's very interesting. And of course, you've seen people who are actually quite close to President Trump, particularly Lindsey Graham, who was on Fox News the other day and extremely critical of the Saudis and of MBS and basically saying that he was toxic. So you have people who, generally speaking, are supportive of the president and close to his foreign policy who've made it very clear that there is a break here and that they're going to insist that there's going to be some kind of sanctions levied against the Saudis. We already have the Global Magnitsky Act that has been triggered by a request by a bipartisan group of senators, so that is in train. And we've seen also, again, senior Republicans who are saying that they want to block arms sales. They're putting a hold on arms sales. Senator Paul has already made comments, Senator Gardner from Colorado. And so it does seem that on this particular issue, the Republican Party is divided and that the level of anger on the Hill, which is bipartisan in nature and has been building up over time. And I think that this is an important thing, Paul, which is that if this were just an issue of Jamal Khashoggi, there may be some sympathy for the president's position, the idea that we need to understand what happened. But we have to understand that this is an accumulation of concerns about Saudi behavior, about MBS behavior over issues like Yemen, Qatar, the Ritz-Carlton issue last year, the kidnapping of the Lebanese prime minister. So all of these things have been out there. People have been willing to suspend judgment on him because they liked other things that he was doing in terms of economic and social reform.
But this is,
but now it seems that the balance has shifted.
Thanks, Jerry. Gonul, the Turkish position seems to have been shifting day in and day out. What's going on maybe with President Erdogan? Where does he stand?
Well, that's right, Paul. I think Turks are trying to leverage the evidence that they claim to have on the alleged murder of Jamal to press for both Saudis and Washington. And I think they might be asking for financial help from the Saudis. And from Washington, of course, there are many outstanding issues. But what comes to mind is the Halkbank case. It's a state-owned Turkish bank that faces major fines from U.S. Treasury for allegedly violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. And of course, Turks have been demanding a lenient fine or for the fine to be scrapped altogether. So I think that is part of the negotiations. But I think in the last few days, Turkey's hand is somewhat weakened, especially after Pompeo's visit and also Trump administration's willingness to buy the Saudi narrative that this was a bunch of rogue killers. So I think Turkey has been trying to refute that claim, and that's why we've been seeing leaks that had briefly stopped last week. And now unnamed Turkish officials are again leaking information to Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. So they are trying to link MBS to Khashoggi murder. So they are, for instance, one of the leaks to Washington Post was the scanned passport copies of the 7 Saudis who were the alleged killers. And also to Wall Street Journal, Turkish officials said that the killing took place in front of the Saudi Consul General. So that's why the Turks are saying that, this could not have happened without the authorization of MBS. So they're trying to strengthen their hand.
Well, it's interesting because, the theory of rogue killers, as I recall, was first suggested by the Turks to the Saudis a few days after the event. I forget who it was who said, look, we have experience with our deep state in Turkey. We're not blaming the Saudi state. Perhaps it was rogue elements. So in a way, it seems that, as you're indicating, the Turks wanted to negotiate with the Saudis and get stuff out of it.
Exactly.
Money, loans. But now the Americans are negotiating with the Saudis and leaving the Turks out. Is that
That's
accurate?
right. And that was Yasin Aktay, who was a very close advisor to President Erdogan, who suggested that it could be rogue killers. But I think it just suggested to me that there were negotiations going on, and Erdogan would not really let this go. The reason they really want to keep the focus on what happened to Khashoggi so that their hand is stronger. But I think the recent leaks suggest to me that they are not getting what they want from Saudis or Washington, because from MBS's perspective, now that you've seen the picture with Pompeo sitting next to him all in smiles, I think there's no reason for him to pay anything to the Turks, and he's known for his almost hatred for Turkish leadership and particularly President Erdogan. So I think that's why Turks are feeling now that they have to do something to increase the pressure on MBS and link him to the alleged murder.
Well, Jerry, as sort of a final comment, because we want to also move on to the Afghan situation, the U.S.-Saudi relationship has had many ups and downs. Where do you place this in the history of crises and then resolutions? And if you were to project 6 months or 1 year into the future, will this be a distant memory, or will this really have transformed the relationship?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it's something that people are really trying to puzzle through. I would say that this is probably the most serious crisis in U.S.-Saudi relations since the September 11th, 2001 attacks in New York and Washington. But it's different this time. And one of the things that I think that we have to keep in mind is that in many ways this is it's a personal crisis. It's not as much about Saudi Arabia as it is about MBS as a person and whether or not he's somebody that the United States can have confidence in going forward.
So not necessarily a crisis in the U.S.-Saudi
not in the
joint
broader
interest, broader relationship.
That
It's
hasn't
like,
really
yeah.
changed, but I think what has changed is how people perceive MBS. And I think in terms of what happens next, I would say that an awful lot depends on whether or not the Saudis come up with some kind of a credible explanation for what happened. Not only an explanation for what happened, but accountability for those who are responsible.
Changes in decision-making.
And changes that make it clear that whatever happened is not going to happen again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me move on to the Afghanistan question. So Afghanistan is holding long overdue parliamentary elections this weekend, and with me to discuss that is the director of our senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, director of our Iran Observed project, and somebody who is from Afghanistan and follows it very closely, Mr. Ahmad Majidyar. Ahmad, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you, Paul.
Give our listeners first sort of a map of where this stands, how important is it, before we get into the details.
So, as you mentioned, the parliamentary elections in Afghanistan were delayed for almost 3 years. So this Saturday, there will be more than 2,500 candidates vying for almost 250 seats in the lower house of the parliament. And the elections are facing two major challenges. The first and foremost is, of course, security, because the elections are happening at a time that security is deteriorating. The Taliban has gained momentum on the battlefield. And also, they have made it clear that they will do everything that they can to disrupt the process.
Well, let me interject right there. Are the elections happening in areas that the government does not control?
There are certain districts in particularly in remote provinces that the Afghan government does not have control, that the Taliban are in control of those places. And also there are certain areas that are contested between the Taliban and the government. So the Election Commission will not be able to open polling centers in those areas.
So in a sense, this will be elections in government-held areas, which are pretty significant.
Well, the government claims that it will hold elections all across the country. But
what do you claim? They claim that, but what
they
are you
claim,
explaining?
But if a significant part of the population is disenfranchised, particularly in the Pashtun areas in the south and east, then that will call into question the legitimacy of the elections. And we've seen examples of that before, because some of the provinces, they have mixed populations, like Hazaras and Pashtuns. In Pashtun areas, they have not been able to vote. And all those candidates from that province have come from one ethnic minority, which have created problems for the government.
Why were the elections postponed before, and what's changed? I mean, since the security situation doesn't seem to be improving much, what has enabled the elections or the decision to hold elections now, whereas they weren't before?
No significant changes. The presidential elections are slated for next year, so they wanted to have the parliamentary elections this year. And indeed, this election also will be a litmus test for the government and also for the international community to see that whether the Afghan government has addressed those shortcomings that have resulted in fraud and problems in previous elections. So that's why it's also important.
Now, there's a lot of, a wide array of candidates. I think around 500 women running, a lot of civil society people, a lot of slogans being thrown around. How significant is the election as a political moment in modern, Afghan life? And then how important will it be in terms of an effective parliament? Will it mean any change in the political system?
Yeah, absolutely, because the elections are a very essential step in building trust in the democratic processes in Afghanistan. What we are seeing, and that's an encouraging point, is that despite the Taliban threat, actually they have killed 10 parliamentary candidates over the past 2 months and have killed also many other organizers of the elections. But despite these threats, Afghan men and women, they are braving the Taliban threats and they are determined to take part in this democratic process. And as you mentioned, there are more than 400 women candidates participating in the elections. And as an Afghan, I also see some cultural change in the country, because some of these women, they go to very remote areas in Afghanistan for campaigning, and we see that they draw hundreds of men to their for their
Interesting,
speech
for the
and
rallies
statements.
and-
And so they come and they attend, and many of them they vote for them. That would be unimaginable in the past. So we see that that's a sort of positive change in the country
And
as
in
well.
terms of the political parties and the makeup of or the potential makeup of the parliament, I mean, other than some of the independents and so on, what are the political party balances that are likely to be represented in the new parliament?
So every candidate just represents himself. We don't have political parties participating in election as parties.
Per se, yeah.
Yes, and Afghanistan also has a very strong presidential system, so the role of parliament has always been very limited. But what we see is that in this election, which is different, is that a lot of young men and young women are participating for the first time. And their slogan is that we are tired of this incompetence and corruption in the Afghan parliament, and we want to bring a change to hold the Afghan government accountable. And also their main slogan is to curb corruption and improve security.
And do you think the parliament would have any capacity to hold the president, the president's cabinet, or the future president accountable? You say it's a rather weak institution. Is it weak because the individuals were not playing a very important role, or it's weak because institutionally it doesn't have the capacity? Does this election matter in potentially curbing corruption, having an impact?
It's a combination of both because some of the parliamentary members, they are affiliated with some of the ruling parties that are forming the government. So they do little to hold the government accountable. And that's what the new generation of these candidates vying for these elections are campaigning for. They are saying that we will not take bribes, we will not accept any corruption, and we'll make sure to hold the government accountable. And of course, the parliament has that oversight capabilities, but it has not used its capacity in the past.
Well, to end this section on the situation in Afghanistan, let's pull back a bit and get your comments on sort of the diplomacy and other things that have been happening. The U.S. has an envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad. He's had meetings recently. Do you see any change in the politics and diplomacy of the outreach to the Taliban? Any new approaches to trying to end this conflict after, 17 years?
Talks with the Taliban have certainly gained momentum, and it was the second time in the past 2-3 months that U.S. representatives met Taliban officials in Qatar to discuss about the political settlement to end the war. But the problem here is that the Taliban has accepted to talk with the Americans about the exit of foreign troops, what they call to end the occupation. However, they have not accepted to sit down with the Afghan government and discuss the prospect for peace. They still consider the Afghan government illegitimate. They have rejected the Afghan government ceasefire. And as I mentioned, while their representatives were meeting American envoy in Qatar, Taliban were waging a campaign of violence against election candidates to disrupt the democratic process.
So as you've written several times in the past, you don't see that we're really in a new dynamic, that the Taliban position is still what it was, that they're willing to talk to the Americans about a U.S. withdrawal, no negotiations with the government on ending the conflict. The war itself is not being decided on the battleground. The government is not winning. The Taliban are not winning. And that, in your view, this remains a very open-ended conflict. Is that an
Yes, the
accurate-
war is certainly a stalemate,
Yeah.
but recently the Taliban has gained some momentum on the battlefield, which in many people's ideas, that means that the Taliban may have even less incentive now to lay down arms and come to the negotiating table at a time that the time is on their end. And also the Trump administration is sending mixed messages about withdrawal of troops, which definitely sends negative message both to friends and enemies, because the Taliban's mantra has always been that if you have the watch, we have the time, we can wait you out.
We can wait you out. Yeah, well, thank you, Ahmad, for your views on the situation there. We hope the elections this weekend go off as peacefully as they can. I want to thank you, Ahmad, for being with us, and thank my other colleagues, Ambassador Jerry Feierstein, who joined us as well as my colleague, Dr. Gonul Tol. Thank you all for listening in to this podcast, and we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.